welcome. Today, we look closely at the 5 men who want the Republican nomination to be the next Mike Bloomberg, or is it Rudy Giuliani? And we ask, what exactly defines a Big Apple Republican? Also today, the fate of federal whistleblowers who say the government has gone too far and undermines civil liberties post 9/11. And re-educating men about women, street art as a weapon against street harassment. First, the GOP mayoral hopefuls. All 5 took the stage at the Roosevelt Hotel last week in an event sponsored by Crain's New York business. Since the mayoral race seems to be very much about how much to be like Mike, the moderator of the forum, who will join us in a minute, began by asking the candidates how they would rate Hizzoner's performance, 1 being the worst, 10 being the best. Here, all mashed together, are the grades they gave.
I would give the mayor an 8.
I'd give Mayor Bloomberg at least a 9.
My number is also 9.
9.
I'd give the mayor a 10.
And in case you're not familiar with all those faces, we saw former Bronx Borough President Adolfo Carrion Jr. giving the mayor an 8, Red Apple Gristedes CEO John Katzimatidis offering at least a 9, former MTA CEO Joseph Lota also rating Mike Bloomberg a 9, the CEO of Manhattan Media, Tom Allen, rated the mayor a 9, and president and founder of the Doe Fund, George Mcdonnell, bestowed that only 10. Joining us now, the debate moderator, Greg David. He writes for Crain's New York Business and heads the business reporting program at CUNY's Graduate School of Journalism. Also with us, Jarrett Murphy, editor-in-chief of City Limits magazine. Welcome to both of you. Welcome back, I should say. Greg, what did you make of those ratings?
Well, I thought they would be high, and I was looking for some differentiation, and there's a little bit, but not very much. What I really hope is that someone asks the Democrats that same question, because I believe their numbers would be much lower, and I'd love to know what Christine Quinn's number is.
And now that you have set the table by asking them, I'm sure somebody will at next opportunity. So that first question had a second half, which was, what would you do differently on the first day in office? And only some answered with something that they could even hope to do on day 1, but it was a good political Rorschach test to see what came to mind first. And so here is a condensed set of responses to that.
What I would do on day 1 would be to review all of the pilot programs.
We train teachers relentlessly.
One of the things I don't like is those bicycle lanes.
To ensure that we prepare the citizenry for full participation, and secondly, that we prepare them to participate in the economy.
Any labor contract that came to me that didn't include health insurance participation on behalf of the New York City employees, I would not sign.
So Jarrett Murphy, what do you make of that? Are there clear distinctions between people in this field and Mayor Mike, nominally a Republican independent, as he is governed?
I don't think any of those are, major enough, separations from the mayor. I think, as Greg said, it's a very favorable crowd. It's like going to a Star Trek convention and being asked, what's your favorite science fiction movie? Everyone wants to, establish that they're a bit independent, but I don't think any of those really fundamentally challenge anything the mayor has done, at least as far as that crowd would be concerned.
Anything there underlying? And I realize that as Jarrett reminds us, they all gave the mayor an 8 to a 10 in general, but was there some theme that broke out of Republican discontent about certain things?
To the extent there was a theme, several people mentioned education, and they would do some things differently and change the emphasis a little bit. I do agree there was no fundamental driving force. After all, what did Joe Lota say? He was going to review pilot programs. I thought that was probably the weakest of the answers.
All right, so let's go into some more clips of these candidates, and we'll do it topic by topic. We'll get to education in a minute. We'll start, though, with the living wage bill and sick leave. Let's see what the candidates said about a living wage, mandated living wage for contractors doing business with the city, and mandatory paid sick leave days for just about every employer in the city. Let's watch. This is Mr. Carrion
The living
first.
wage bill became the killer of the Kingsbridge Armory, which I left on a silver platter when I was the borough president of the Bronx. And we had cut a deal that would create probably 1,000 to 1,200 jobs, economic activity in an area that had a very high unemployment rate. And the local pols and the city council intervened. They pulled the rug out from under that project, and unfortunately, 6 years later, we still have, and after three tries by 3 mayors, we still have an empty building on Kingsbridge Road in an area of very high unemployment. That was because of the imposition of the living wage by people who don't
and
understand
yes or
the
no
economy.
on sick leave?
I'm of 2 minds on sick leave.
You don't get to answer anymore. We're not doing 2 minds here.
From my point of view, not the role of city government to determine that all private businesses should have an HR policy and it's determined by the city council. I mean, it's absurd to have that type of approach. If the city wants to make a rule and regulation that says the people that they're doing business with need to have a paid sick leave policy, that's fine. But to all businesses in the city, large or small, to determine what their human resources policies are is incorrect. It's the same as far as the living wage bill or in fact, the minimum wage bill.
Up to the age of 23, 24, maybe there'll be a lesser minimum wage, and maybe above the age of 24, maybe a higher minimum wage. That way, people could still raise their family.
You know, sick leave, minimum wage, government can do things creatively. Life is not always about black and white, there's grays. As John said, and I've been advancing this idea for about a year now, we can have a dual minimum wage. The same thing I think can be true of sick leave. I run a small business. I actually want my people to have 5 days of sick leave each year, because when they come to work sick and they infect 4 people next to them, that's bad business.
The minimum wage, paid sick leave, this new genius idea of unemployed people being able to sue you if you don't hire them. Whoever came up with that ought to have their head examined.
All right. So what did George Mcdonnell mean at the end there by unemployed people being able to sue you if you don't hire them?
The city council's passing a bill that would say that if you didn't hire someone because they were already unemployed, that would be illegal in New York if the fact that they were unemployed was a factor in your decision. Other cities have passed bills which say you can't say you will only consider employed people. There's reason to believe that New York is the only city that would allow lawyers to bring cases to sue, and that's what he was getting at about it.
Is that something city limits or you support? Would you and presumably Greg have a difference on this, or you and George Mcdonnell, that there shouldn't be discrimination against unemployed people based on their unemployed status?
I mean, I think, it depends exactly what the status means. The simple fact of not having a job, obviously, it doesn't make sense to discriminate against someone for that. Whether you can actually legislate something like that is always a question. Sometimes the unemployment is tied up with other factors in someone's background, and I would find it just practically difficult to distinguish among them, I would think. But yeah, that discrimination would be something that we would probably, in a journalistic way, turn our nose up at.
Yeah, and I thought Joe Loda's answer was interesting there because he made sure to make a distinction between something that the city could require of its contractors, paid sick leave, but not of employers citywide who weren't doing business with the city. Do you find that a meaningful distinction?
I think it was a meaningful distinction. The broader question was, inequality is a problem in New York. Does the city government have a role in fixing it? And the answer from the Democratic candidates is yes. The answer from these candidates is no, with some exceptions that there's some ways the minimum wage could be raised, though no one said the city should raise it rather than the state. And Alan and Kiriakou do support some sort of sick leave. It's unclear whether they support the bill that's on the table.
Right, and the candidates were asked by Greg about inequality as an issue in the city and if it's something that city government should address. Perhaps George Mcdonnell from the Doe Fund was the most passionate on that. Watch.
What we need in this city are jobs. I've spent 25 years creating jobs for people at the bottom of our society. I know about inequity. Nobody needs to tell me about inequity. I've been helping the men and women who have come out of our penal institutions. The mass incarceration of African American men may have made us safer, but it leaves us with generation after generation of broken families that are uneducated, that that have multiple barriers to employment, and yet we overcome that. At the Doe Fund, we've always paid above the minimum wage, and our graduates get jobs that are over $11 an hour. Now, why do we need government to create an artificial wage, to control the wage, when the people are actually getting jobs above what they say the minimum wage is? We don't need government control.
All right, George Mcdonnell. Now, he's not a household name in New York. He's well known to people who've been following his work, who know the workers who he hires, who do a lot of cleaning up around the Grand Central area. But he's a pretty conservative guy for a homeless advocate.
Yes, and he's a self-help person, and I think that's the message he's trying to convey. And he thinks he's done a great thing at the Doe Fund, and it makes him qualified to be mayor. I think that's the driving force behind what he's up to.
Yeah. What do you think after seeing him on the stump now? In terms of, I'm not asking you for an endorsement, but in terms of qualifications.
I met with him a few months ago and was unimpressed. He has studied up a lot, and he was a lot better. That's what I'll say.
I would just make one point about McDonald's point talking about inequality versus jobs, and the fact that jobs will help us solve inequality, as Greg's pointed out in his columns recently. Bloomberg's created quite a few jobs. Kind of, I think you talked about a Bloomberg recovery, but we've also seen rising inequality over the same period. They obviously aren't one and the same thing, and I think McDonald's point that the jobs he finds for guys coming out of his program pay better than minimum wage. That could be an argument against a living wage, or it could be an argument for a higher minimum wage, because obviously the market can bear it.
At another point, McDonald, and again it might have raised some eyebrows coming from a homeless advocate, said that the city should stop allowing people to just come and claim shelter. There is a law in New York that it's a guaranteed right to shelter under the New York State Constitution, and I believe he called for repealing that law. Even though we have record homelessness in the city right now. What do you make of that?
Well, the shelters can turn you away if they find that you have some other place to live. In fact, largely that's what the shelter system does when it evaluates people, to see if there's a couch that you can sleep on or a brother you can stay with. So the city does have the ability to distinguish between different applicants. I was talking to the Department of Homeless Services today, actually, and the reason why we have record numbers in our shelter system now is not because new people are coming in, it's because people in the system don't have a place to go. That's where the bulk of the numbers are coming from nowadays.
Greg,
which is actually the point he made.
Yes.
It was the point he made. And the point he was getting at is the headlines suggest enormous numbers of people are suddenly homeless, and the reality might be different, as you just described, and that is what he actually was trying to get across.
Which the mayor seemed to amplify later in the week when he said somebody could come in on their private jet, get into their private limo, arrive at a homeless shelter, and demand the city give them shelter. I don't know that anybody's ever done that in the history of the city, but there's some kind of point that they're both trying to make.
Yes, well, this is the very conservative critique about how it is the very existence in New York alone among all cities for this right to shelter that creates the homelessness demand. So that's the conservative argument, and it's very hard for the media to cover it effectively and for people to understand it.
Before we go on to property taxes, the next issue, did you get a sense from this panel of either Republicans or people who want to run on the Republican line at least, that inequality was a big issue to them? Because of course it's such a huge issue on the left. Did they feel that, the spike in homelessness in New York City is real? We have 21% official poverty rate up each of the last 3 years at the same time as the Dow is hitting record highs.
No, they would argue, and Joe Lode actually quoted one of my columns, that all those stats are superficial and don't convey the real attitude in New York. You just said poverty is up 3 consecutive years. Well, it turns out that poverty is up less in New York than any other large city, and New York's ranking on the poverty list has fallen by a lot among the largest cities in the country. So the answer is the headlines, the easy media approach may not be an accurate reflection of the economy, and I think that is what they all believe.
One more quick take on this?
Yeah, I would say, the city's ranking has fallen from like 8th highest to, I think, 12th or 14th highest. So it's not something to sort of have a parade on Broadway about. Inequality is an issue in the city. I think you're not going to find the Republican candidates making that the center of their campaign. That's why I think we're seeing this pushback from the business community to elevate business issues. We've seen some fundraising around that because I think they're concerned about inequality becoming a dominant issue in the campaign. That's obviously what they don't want.
Okay. Next issue, property taxes. Tell us how you set this up. Before we see a clip, how did you ask a property taxes question at the forum?
New York has the most convoluted property tax system we have, which gives enormous tax breaks, originally to single-family homeowners, now to people who own condos and co-ops. What this means is that renters pay an enormous property tax burden. And in one of the greatest ironies around, the most expensive co-ops pay a fraction of the property taxes of expensive rental units that are right next door. And the Bloomberg administration has shown no willingness to tackle this issue.
All right, so here is a montage of all 5 candidates responding to that question on property taxes. This runs about a minute. Again, George Mcdonnell speaks first.
I'll tell you this right now. If I'm mayor of the city of New York, I'm not going to raise property taxes. It's the only thing that the mayor can do and the city council can do directly themselves without the state legislature, and I wouldn't do it.
What concerns me is the backdoor way that we are assessing and using residential rental property and commercial property as sort of the ATM for the city's treasury, and we look at a forecast and say, how do we now backfill? And who do we go to? We're not going to go to the homeowners. That's politically unpopular. But let's go to the property owners.
The Department of Finance is told how much they have to generate. They're given a number by the Office of Management and Budget, and then they back into the number. That is not the way property taxes have ever worked in the city of New York, and that's not the way it's going to work in the future.
We're not going to get a commuter tax, so let's forget about that. It's not going to happen. Possibly, we got casinos on our right, casinos on our left. How do you tax out-of-towners? How do you tax foreigners?
Well, I think we have to put a commission together and study how to do this. Obviously, it can't be done radically, but it has to be done in a way that makes it fair throughout the city. This is, I think, long overdue.
So were they saying, read my lips, no new property taxes? Or was
They
it
were saying, read my
short of
lips,
that?
no, no new property taxes. And by the way, I don't have any more courage than the mayor. I'm not touching this with a 10-foot pole either.
All right, let's go on to the next issue, education. Obviously a huge issue in the city now, as always. And we're going to play a clip here of candidate Tom Allen, best known as the owner of Manhattan Media Group. Maybe you knew his publications already, Our Town, the West Side Spirit, the New York Family paper, a few others. And education is his big issue. Here's 40 seconds of what he had to say about it.
Testing has replaced learning in this city. I was a high school English teacher 25 years ago, and I'm the father of 3 children who've gone through public schools. My kids did not take a foreign language until they were in 6th or 7th grade. We are living in a global economy, and we need to make sure that our kids speak other languages. Our kids don't take science until they're in 6th or 7th grade, and we wonder why so few Americans get graduate degrees in science. Why don't those kids get those classes? Because we don't test for them in the early grades. We have to reinstate science and foreign languages in young grades so our students become more adept at them.
Tom Allen. And another thing that he said, Jarrett, was that while everybody likes to talk now about the ability to fire bad teachers, a much bigger problem is that all the teachers who are entering the profession, of them all, about half leave within 5 years. So retention of good teachers is a lot bigger a problem than being stuck with bad teachers. So does this make him a liberal or a conservative on education?
Well, I think I've seen Allen at this forum and at one a couple weeks ago where he was speaking to a Democratic crowd, and he does kind of play to both. But I think it goes to a point actually, and the property tax issue is a corollary to it. Here's an issue where you have a remarkable similarity in how Democrats and Republicans approach it. Everybody knows that there's something not quite right with how Bloomberg's run the schools, but nobody really wants to tinker with anything fundamental about mayoral control. Nobody's going to give that up. Usually we're talking about cosmetic fixes here and there. I didn't hear how Allen was going to change the dynamics for those teachers who tend to leave after 5 years. That clearly is a big issue. I know Loda referred, I think, explicitly to merit pay. I don't know if that was an answer that was subscribed to by the group. But again, this is largely about kind of tinkering with the issue as opposed to changing anything fundamental in how Bloomberg's approached the schools.
But there was one major distinction. 3 of the candidates clearly went after the U of T's position on teacher evaluations and said they wanted more power to fire bad teachers. They said things like 90% of the teachers are good, but we have to get rid of the other 10%. No Democratic candidate, all of whom want the endorsement of the UFT, is going to say that at a forum.
In that context, what do you make of Chris Quinn, just to bring up one of the Democrats for a minute, her launch video over the weekend, which started with her reverence for her father's union background and saying he was an electrician, but really he was his shop steward. And she, in fact, oh, we have that clip? I think we have that clip. Let's roll that, and then I'll ask the question, because this is so interesting. Let's watch Chris Quinn.
My dad was an electrical worker, but really what he was a shop steward in his union. And he went on strike twice when I was a kid. So I learned through those experiences what it meant for people to hang together, to stay together, what it meant to him that his union never gave in, and what it meant to have good insurance because of his union. So when my mother was sick, we had no worries. She could get any of the care she ever needed because he had that union that took care of him.
So she is running to try to be more business friendly than Democrats generally. She's the only one in the Democratic PAC who opposes the paid sick leave bill. But then she starts her announcement video with this Valentine to the unions. What do you make of it?
She has the mayor's support. She has the support of large parts of the business community. She has the best name recognition. If the unions are in her camp, we can call this election today. The unions are the only force are the major force in the Democratic primary that presumably that Bill de Blasio needs to make this a competitive race. That's what it's about.
Absolutely, and solidifying her biography as coming from working class roots and being a true blue Democrat and also being able to talk over piano music. I mean, that's what it's about. But Greg's right. I mean, that's the last piece that she really needs to make this a home run for her.
And how about Carry On as a candidate? He's probably not even going to be allowed to run as a Republican. We don't know that yet. Maybe he will. But he already has the Independence Party line. And he told me on my radio show this week that if he does not get the Republican nomination as well, he will still run with full force in November, even though that means he could wind up playing spoiler, probably helping a Republican candidate against the Democratic nominee if he really tries to, run fully on that Independence Party line.
I don't think so. He might. I don't think so. I think people have forgotten who he is. I don't think he's making many waves. The history shows that the marginal candidates really fade at the end, both in primaries and in the general election. I don't understand what a lot of them are doing. I don't understand what Tom Allen's doing. I don't understand
Maybe
what
he wants to be
McDonnell's
school
doing.
chancellor, Tom Allen.
He may. He may be running to be school chancellor, absolutely.
And he's got the Liberal Party line, but he says if he doesn't think he can win, he won't run actively in November. Last thing, you made a little news yourself when, in a setup to a question, you said that Mayor Giuliani, at least in 2001, acted like a jerk, and you got some pushback on that, obviously, but you also got some love on the New York Post editorial page, which wrote, "Who among Bloomberg's nicer-than-pie potential successors has the capacity to unhesitatingly knock heads, to be a jerk about municipal economics, to speak truth to powerful unions, to be a jerk when the activists come calling with demands for imposing anti-market social services mandates on private business, to be a jerk about high taxes, especially about taxes." They liked it.
Maybe they liked it. Look, the audience didn't like it, so it was inappropriate. But most of all, I was trying to ask a legitimate question: is Joe Lhota running as the next, as the return of Rudy Giuliani? That might play in the audience that I was moderating the debate from. Might play in the Republican primary. Would it really play in the general election in November? I'm not so sure. I didn't get to ask the question, and in doing so, I really failed.
All right. Well, succeeded in many other ways, clarifying a lot of issues with those Republican candidates. It's early in the year. A lot of politicking yet to come. Thank you for helping set the baseline.
Thank you.
Jarrett, thank you.
Thank you.
And would it be legal if the CIA used a drone to kill an American on U.S. soil? What if that person was accused of, say, financing the enemy? Is that part of Washington's definition of an enemy combatant? And would they then be liable for such a killing? Well, that hypothetical scenario and Senator Rand Paul's 13-hour filibuster, which briefly delayed confirmation of John Brennan as CIA chief last week, again raised the question of what the government can and cannot do in the name of national security. But raising the question can itself be risky. According to a forthcoming documentary film, federal employees increasingly risk it all if they go public when their conscience says, my government has clearly crossed the line. Here is a glimpse of the film, Silenced.
Part of the purpose of doing what they've been doing for the last several years is to destroy you.
I never thought of myself as a whistleblower. Sometimes I go back and forth in my mind where I wish I had kept my mouth shut, and other times I wish that I had shouted it from the rooftops.
There is information that the public in a functioning democracy has a right to know.
Thomas Jefferson said that an informed citizenry is the crucial part of the democracy.
I took an oath. I had to deal with a government who was in violation of the oath, and I couldn't remain silent.
I could not live with myself knowing that another human being could be put to death because I kept my mouth shut.
Would you call it torture?
Waterboarding is probably something that we shouldn't be in the business of doing. I was the first CIA officer to confirm the use of torture techniques against al-Qaeda prisoners.
Our country had instituted a torture policy, and we ran head into that.
You're supposed to accept these things as normal because to the people who have been there, it is completely normal.
NSA would now instrument the United States of America for the purposes of dragnet blanket electronic surveillance on a vast scale.
I explained the facts of my case to my lawyer. He said, wow, you meet the classic textbook definition of a whistleblower.
We're people who join the government for all the good reasons, work for a number of years, and then confront something that just stops us.
The White House has approved it. It's all legal. As soon as he said it's all legal, the hair stood up on the back of my neck.
That's whistleblower Thomas Drake, a former senior executive with the National Security Agency, in the documentary Silenced. It's about the federal whistleblowers who publicly questioned U.S. national security policy after 9/11 and about the risks of truth-telling in what some call the age of unending war. Joining us to discuss the making of Silenced, producer and director James Spione, and featured in the film, whistleblower Jesselyn Radack, a former ethics attorney with the Department of Justice. Ms. Radack is now the National Security and Human Rights Director at the Government Accountability Project in Washington, D.C. Welcome, both of you. Thank you for doing this. And Jesselyn, you said in that clip that how could you not speak out if being silent meant somebody else's life might be taken? What were you referring to?
I was referring to the fact that at that time, the so-called American Taliban, John Walker Lind, was facing death penalty counts. And I know the line is different for every whistleblower in terms of when they blow the whistle, but for me, that was a line that I was not willing to cross. Tell us why you made this film.
I think just listening to Jesselyn right now kind of reminded me why. I was very attracted to the character of these people who were all in different agencies and all faced sort of different dilemmas. But I think at the core is this idea of someone willing to stand up on their conscience, on principle, and speak out in spite of the fact that they probably know very well, especially now, that there are going to be severe repercussions.
After the Rand Paul filibuster last week, the Senate, including with Paul's vote, did vote to confirm John Brennan as CIA director. There were 31 Republican no votes, and Leahy of Vermont, a Democrat, and Merkley of Oregon, a Democrat, also voted not to confirm, and the one independent, Bernie Sanders of Vermont. What to you does Brennan's choice say about the Obama administration's view of civil liberties versus national security concern?
It says that we are willing to reward people who engage in illegal and unethical and unconstitutional conduct, but if you dare expose that conduct, If it embarrasses the government, or worse yet, exposes war crimes, you will be thrown in jail. It was a heartbreaking confirmation to me because Brennan, after all, pioneered the torture techniques and became the drone daddy of our country.
It seems that under Obama, we've had fewer conversations about waterboarding and torture, despite the nomination of Brennan and now confirmation of Brennan to be CIA director. Instead, we're talking about weaponized drones.
Right.
Why did the conversation switch topics, do you think?
Well, I think they switched policies. The torture, I mean, at least they claimed they were going to stop torture, and that was not approved anymore. And I think for some reason, President Obama and his advisors gravitated toward this new policy, which some have criticized as saying, well, it avoids the whole detention and torture thing entirely because you just get rid of people completely.
You connect these two issues in the film. How would you say they're connected?
Well, I think they're connected because it really is a connection between the Bush administration and the Obama administration. Even though the policies are different, I think there's this very clear continuity in claiming executive power, greater and greater executive power, and I think when it comes to the issues of terrorism and as you say, this idea of an unending war, it's kind of seen as almost a blank check, I think. Which is why it was sort of startling the other day for people when Rand Paul got up and on the Senate floor for hours and hours and questioned the president. I don't think we've seen that in a long time, a public challenging of presidential policy like that.
Obama uses something called the 1917 Espionage Act. He's used it at least 7 times. The most recent being an Arabic translator contracted by the Navy and charged with possessing classified documents. What is the Espionage Act, and why do you think Americans should be concerned with it today?
The Espionage Act is a little-known World War I era law that was meant to go after spies, not whistleblowers. Significantly, it was first used to go after Pentagon Papers whistleblower Daniel Ellsberg in 1970. That case collapsed with no charges being brought because of government misconduct. Then there were a few other people who had been charged under it, but then suddenly in 2010, Tom Drake was charged under the Espionage Act, which is one of the most serious charges you can level against an American. It basically says you are an enemy of the state, and what you did was out to harm the United States or benefit a foreign nation. It's an incredibly harsh hammer to use in overcharging people, particularly for telling the truth.
And what did Tom Drake actually do as you see it?
What Tom Drake actually did, he didn't disclose anything to anybody. He retained unclassified information about wrongdoing by the National Security Agency dealing with vast domestic sweeping surveillance of American citizens when there were programs available that were cheaper, effective, and could have protected people's privacy rights.
In the conservative National Review magazine, Kevin Williamson raised an interesting comparison to Vietnam in response to conservative columnist Charles Krauthammer. Williamson wrote, "If sympathizing with our enemies and propagandizing on their behalf is the equivalent of making war on the country, then the Johnson and Nixon administrations should have bombed every elite college campus in the country during the 1960s. Students in Ann Arbor, Michigan were actively and openly raising funds for the Viet Cong throughout the war." Now, that was written a few weeks ago, and curiously enough, Rand Paul in his filibuster raised the specter of, well, they could have weaponized, droned out Jane Fonda, right, when she was displaying Viet Cong weaponry as a piece of theater and things like that. Do you think the Espionage Act has ever been used appropriately?
Well, I think there are a few cases, but certainly in the last few years, it's clear that it's being used against people who aren't talking to foreign nations and actively trying to undermine the United States. They're talking to the press. And I think you know, journalists and people like you should be very concerned about that. I mean, I think that seems to be almost a backdoor way, as someone like Thomas Drake would say, of sort of infringing on press freedoms. And if there's an irony to the title of my film, Silenced, in some ways these people haven't been silenced. They're here talking with the possible exception of John Kiriakou, who is now in prison. But I think the silence refers to something bigger, and I think that's the kind of chilling effect, the example being made of these people. For how many whistleblowers that actually stand up, I really wonder how many people are keeping their mouths shut, because it's a very intimidating thing to see such extreme charges be brought against someone for speaking their conscience.
Now, we've been talking about the politics. Let's look now at whistleblowers' lives and some of the consequences displayed in the film of speaking out.
It wasn't until I was about an hour into this interview that I realized, wait a minute, they're investigating me.
The apparatus of the U.S. government was turned against me. Every phone call you've ever made, emails you've ever sent, your bank statements, tax records.
I was trying to be honest and obey the law, and yet I'm the one who ends up having to hire a team of lawyers.
They set the target. They put the bullseye on me. It said, we're going to make an example of him.
I have to try to protect my children from being exposed to it. I've got the FBI surveilling me on and off for the last 7 months.
You have to mortgage your house. You have to empty your bank account.
I've applied for every job I can think of. Haven't gotten even an email or a call back.
The people that you used to work with have turned against you. Your neighbors are at least suspicious because it's not every day that government investigators are knocking on their doors.
What has now happened to my family? It's a very tormented existence.
You're not loyal. You're not a good American. You're a terrorist sympathizer.
That secrecy regime, despite President Obama's pledges of transparency and openness, has only continued to expand.
I'm not the pushover that these guys think I am. I'm as tough as they are, and I'm gonna fight.
Excerpt from the trailer for the forthcoming documentary, Silenced. And that was ex-CIA agent John Kiriakou, who recently pleaded guilty to disclosing classified information, which included the name of a covert CIA officer, to a reporter. A father of 5, just last week he began a 2.5-year sentence, and I understand you were both there as his prison term began last week. Tell us about it, Jesselyn, and were his children with him as well?
His children, his 5 children, did not go with him to prison. It would be way too traumatizing for that to have occurred. But it was absolutely heartbreaking. I'm one of John's attorneys, and it's been one of the most difficult cases for me professionally. I'm used to seeing whistleblowers like Tom Drake, who also has 5 kids, being blacklisted and bankrupted and broken. Normally, whistleblowers would get fired or have their security clearances pulled, but now, having them put in jail, that's something I could not have imagined in my wildest nightmares.
But he did plead guilty, and I'm not very familiar with his case, to a crime disclosing classified information, which included the name of a covert CIA officer to a reporter. We remember how big a deal it was when the name of a covert CIA officer was disclosed to the press by somebody in Vice President Cheney's office.
Right.
Why should we have a lot of sympathy for him in this case?
Well, that goes, I think, to the issue of selective prosecution and leaks that matter versus leaks that don't. You don't have to go back to the Bush administration. You can just look at what happened with the production of this film, Zero Dark 30, which had very high-level access, in which sources and methods and names were revealed, but those were apparently all approved. And so, you know, if you look at the letter of the law, you can see that it's not really applied equivalently. So why was it applied to John Kiriakou? Well, John Kiriakou was the first former CIA agent to confirm that waterboarding was policy. He started to be quite outspoken about it and changed his position on it into becoming sort of more critical of the policy. And, you know, the CIA had been looking at this for many years. There had been reports internally in the CIA. And so he was basically on the list to a problem, as someone who was talking out of turn, as someone who was saying things critical of what we were doing. And I think, you know, something that Jesselyn talks about a lot, quite obviously, torture was questionable policy, probably an illegal policy, and certainly, in my view, an immoral policy. And this is just something you're not allowed to criticize.
Do you want to add to that about the Kiriakou case?
Yeah, I would add that, you know, this case is not about exposing an undercover identity. It's not about leaking. If it were about leaking, our jails would be bursting, overflowing with people in Washington, D.C. who leak daily. It's about torture, and John did expose the torture program for the first time, acknowledging it publicly. He called waterboarding torture, and he said we shouldn't be doing this. And ever since he made that statement, the CIA has been gunning for him ever since 2007. This case is about torture, not about a name. And by the way, the person who did leak Valerie Plame's name, that was purely for political purposes, and he served no jail time.
How have you come through your ordeal? You were an ethics attorney at the Department of Justice when, as you were starting to get at before, the so-called American Taliban was questioned, and your revelations to Newsweek showed being questioned without being advised of his rights. And you blew the whistle on that. After that, I read that you were on the no-fly list for a while. What else happened to you, and how are things now with your own situation?
In my case, after I blew the whistle, I ended up being put under criminal investigation, though I was never told for what. I was referred to the state bars in which I'm licensed as an attorney based on a secret report that I had no access to. I was put on the no-fly list. I was forced out of my private sector job, and the government even assisted my private law firm in trying to take away the meager unemployment benefits I was granted. So it was a long number of years to get out from under this cloud, and the bar referral is still pending after more than 9 years.
How have your case and others affected the chill in Washington? Is it harder to be a whistleblower now? Is it harder to tell the truth if a government employee thinks there's an uncomfortable truth to be told?
I think it's much harder now that whistleblowers are actually being prosecuted, because not only are they going to risk getting fired and losing their job and their livelihood, their profession, and their ability to work in a given industry, but they may be forfeiting their liberty, decades in jail, the rest of their life in jail.
Do you have the money to finish this film? I understand it's still in post-production. Who's financing it? Who's interested in this?
I'm very thankful to the folks at Kickstarter for setting up that site, because partly it's being financed by small contributions from people on the web right now.
Kickstarter is everybody.
Yeah, well, right, and you know, so I've raised some funds for post-production for that. There's also going to be some other more conventional investment sources, and hopefully some pre-sales to Europe. I'm not the producer that really handles all that usually. I mean, I'm a director mainly and a creative guy, but it's being cobbled together.
And so we'll look for this in about a year?
Yeah, we'll be in post-production probably for most of this year.
But so relevant right now with what's been going on that we wanted to feature this today.
Well, I really appreciate it. And, you know, I just wanted to say, it's very fresh in my mind. Having accompanied John Kiriakou to jail, I was there when he parted from his children and his wife. You know, I just have to say, you know, as a documentary filmmaker, I struggle to stay objective, but I also am trying to feel my way through these subjects, because that's what's important about it. And to see someone's freedom taken from them because of something they said was a very disturbing thing for me. And it's one of the things that really, for me, makes this whole topic very potent.
Thank you both very much for coming in.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks very much.
Up next, Enough, Hey Baby, street art versus street harassment. Women, do you get this a lot on the street? Hey baby, how about a smile? Or how you doing, beautiful? Well, for those even vaguely acquainted with feminism or manners, these intrusions constitute unacceptable street harassment. Much has been done to put a stop to it, including subway announcements, and there's even an app for that, believe it or not. But our next guest is fighting street harassment with her own street art. Joining us, Brooklyn artist Tatyana Fazlali-Zada. Welcome to the program.
Hi, thanks for having me.
We're going to show some examples of your work, but first give us a preview. What are we about to see?
Okay, so these are We Paste posters that I recently created starting last fall. And they depict portraits of women that I drew and added captions to. And they're supposed to speak directly towards men and supposed to speak for the women that are addressed in the posters.
All right, so we have on the screen two. What are we looking at?
So these are two posters that recently went up in Bed-Stuy in Brooklyn on Halsey and Tompkins. And one poster reads, "Stop telling women to smile," and the other reads, "Women do not owe you their time or conversation."
All right, and we'll see actually close-ups and even better shots of those in a minute. But first to, what are we going to, we're going to, oh, okay, here's another one. Women are not seeking your validation.
Yes.
Addressed to men, obviously.
Right, yeah.
And that message seems pretty straightforward. How are men taking it?
The response from men has been, it's been varied, but it's mostly been some defensiveness and men being a little accusatory as far as what these posters are saying. This poster in particular, or this one, is speaking to experiences that I've experienced. So been called all types of names that are not mine. And
this one, I understand that there's been some reaction. For people who can't read it, if this is displaying too small on your TV sets, my name is not baby, shorty, sexy, sweetie, honey, pretty, boo, sweetheart, ma. What's your response to some women who say that speaking back to male street harassers may invite escalation? Or what advice do you have for women and girls on how to handle the kind of harassment that this poster addresses?
Well, I don't think that these posters are inviting an escalated harassment towards women. I think that it's inviting conversation and a dialogue to happen, which I think is important. I think this is my way of addressing men. This came out of personal experiences for me, the reason that I did these posters. So this is my way of expressing myself, because a lot of times in the moment you don't say anything, you just kind of keep it moving. And so my advice towards women, I'm honestly not sure, because I'd honestly be giving advice to myself, and it's hard to kind of address that and to say what you should do in the situation, because each situation is different. I think the advice should go to men who are doing the harassing. I think that those are the ones who need to change their behavior.
Which is why you direct your posters toward men, you said.
Right. It's directed towards men, but it's also for women. Like, it's for women to kind of walk past these and feel empowered.
And some men are talking back to you right on your posters. So we have a slide up of that "Stop Telling Women to Smile" poster with apparently some comments written on it. And one guy wrote, "A guy telling you to smile says to show the beauty they see in you." Or, "If you have a frown on your face all day long, that leads to a scorn, bitter attitude. You should smile, be happy." And someone else wrote, you can see that on the right, I think, "Relax."
Yeah.
How do you react to the reaction?
Well, I think, first of all, it's great that he did react and that he didn't notice and consider it. That's all these posters are really asking for, is a man to kind of stop and consider what the posters are saying. And that he actually took the time out to write all of that is pretty great as well. But I don't think that he really understands what it's saying. I don't think that women walk around with a frown on their face or with scowls on their face. I think a lot of times women are just walking around with a neutral face. It's not that they're particularly happy or sad, they're just going about their day and minding their business. And I think that that's what the problem is, when someone comes in and tells you how to wear your face, or that they feel entitled to tell you how you should wear your face.
Because too many men think that women are there for the men's entertainment.
Exactly.
Yeah. How do you decide where exactly to put these posters?
I decide based on a few different things. One being, does it make a good spot for street art and wheat paste? Is it a building or a wall where I think this wheat paste will stay up for a while? And I also think about, is there traffic here? Is there a lot of foot traffic? Is this a place where street harassment might happen a lot? And is it a place where I've experienced street harassment myself? And on this particular block, I had experienced street harassment myself.
How important do you think it is that men educate other men about street harassment?
I think it's extremely important. I think it's one thing coming from a woman, but it's an entirely different thing when you have a man telling another man that he shouldn't treat women a certain way or in a bad way. I think that when it comes from a man, usually men are being supported when they're treating a woman, when they're harassing a woman on the street. For a man to step up and say, hey, no, that's not cool, you shouldn't do that, I think it's more important than a woman saying it, honestly.
And there's probably a lot of pressure, kind of social pressure on men, especially in certain situations, to vocalize to women who are passing them by on the street. So the peer pressure tends to go in the other direction, don't you think?
Yeah, definitely. And I think that happens, you know, with just young boys growing up. You're taught that you shouldn't have emotions and that you should treat women a certain way and that you shouldn't cry and things like that. And I think that all contributes to all of this.
So let's look at another poster. And this one says, women do not owe you their time or conversation.
Yeah.
Similar to, it's not women's obligation to smile at you, right?
Exactly.
And this one also got well written on and seemed to have started a conversation. I have some of the transcript here. A male wrote, whoever put this up, please be open for discussion on this, from a guy. So maybe a guy who's trying to talk, ain't trying to get your numbers, this says, could be trying to add a little knowledge to your day. And another wrote, a cocky woman, interesting choice of words, who blows a guy off isn't that attractive no matter how good you look. And number 3, not every guy is trying to get in your pants. What do you make of those reactions?
Well, I think that you might not be trying to get in a woman's pants, but if you're demanding conversation from her, that's still not acceptable. And I think that, you know, it's not about being a cocky woman. It's about being a woman, period, about being a human being and having your own space and having your own right to walk down the street and feel comfortable in doing that. A lot of times you don't feel comfortable, you don't feel safe. You feel violated simply walking from your house to the train or to school or wherever. And I think it's just about feeling comfortable in a space, in an environment, and that's all it is. It's not about being cocky.
And to the guy who wrote on that poster, maybe a guy's just trying to add a little knowledge to your day. I see a woman wrote back, what makes you think you have enough knowledge to add anything to anyone? Your ego.
Yeah, there's a dialogue happening, which I guess is good, yeah.
Do you, I mean, I've been having this conversation with guests, honestly, for decades. Do you think things are getting better, at least, in, you know, decades into the modern feminist movement?
I think so. I think that things are getting more attention, which is great. I think that there's a huge online presence for and about street harassment, and women are kind of stepping up and speaking up about it. And I think that that helps move it along, absolutely.
There's a Tumblr with some of these now too, right?
There's a
Moving
Tumblr.
them along.
Yeah. There's a Tumblr. I put them up online. A lot of the images just kind of appeared online, and so I decided to kind of compile them and have a space for people to see these online.
And is this it for this topic for you and your work as an artist, and you move on to other things, or is this kind of a crusade you're going to go further with?
I think it's a crusade I'm going to go further with. Absolutely. I definitely want to expand this project, make it bigger, make the work bigger, and do a lot more work with it. Absolutely.
Other cities?
Other cities, yes. Bigger work, murals, possibly. A lot of different things. I definitely want to keep this going. I think it's important.
Well, thank you for sharing it with us.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
And that's our program for this week. We premiere a new show every Wednesday evening at 7:30. Next time, women tech entrepreneurs in Silicon Alley. Is it hard to break in? And tune into my radio program weekdays 10 a.m. till noon on WNYC 93.9 FM and AM 820. I'm Brian Lehrer. Thanks for watching.